Yes, everyone, let's begin with a question about mythology. When we speak of Greek mythology, what exactly do we mean? Is what we today call classical Greek mythology, that great mythological world, which has been continuously retold in art, literature, and culture from the Renaissance to the present day, truly the mythology of ancient Greece itself? Or is it a cultural construct that was shaped later? These questions and their answers are extremely important. This is precisely the point I want to emphasize. Greek mythology, as we know it today, is, to a great extent, a narrative through which modern Europe projected its own ideals onto the past. In other words, it is a cultural reflection that was reshaped by the bourgeois world in order to legitimize its own utopian ideals. One must not forget this. The people who lived in the brilliant Athens of the 5th century BCE, during the age of Pericles, certainly knew the myths. However, the mythological universe they experienced was never as orderly, flawless, or entirely centered on Olympus as the one presented to us today. So why do we perceive it in this way? One of the main reasons is that we have viewed history through a selective lens. The aesthetic understanding developed by Europe, particularly through French classicism, highlighted only certain aspects of the Greek world, while rendering much of the rest virtually invisible. For this very reason, Greek mythology became an instrument. Under the influence of Philhellenism and Grecophile thought, the West reconstructed Greek mythology not merely as an ancient system of belief, but as an aesthetic symbol that glorified its own cultural identity. As a result, mythology became almost a sacred artistic language of modern Western culture. What we now call classical Greek mythology or Olympian mythology is, in fact, largely the product of this process of reinterpretation. On the surface, it appears that ancient Greece is being described. In reality, however, modern Europe is justifying its own cultural values through the image of the past. The movement known as the Return to Antiquity, which began during the Renaissance, is often presented as an objective rediscovery of the ancient world. Yet this return was far from innocent. As antiquity was rediscovered, it was simultaneously reselected, reinterpreted, and reconstructed in accordance with specific ideological objectives. Joachim Winckelmann's portrayal of classical Greek art as the pinnacle of ideal beauty, the adoption of Greek culture as a model by French classicism, and Europe's treatment of antiquity as the absolute beginning of civilization are all different manifestations of the same intellectual tradition. Consequently, what we encounter here is not merely an aesthetic preference, but also the philosophical, cultural, and artistic expression of a single-centered worldview. One of the clearest examples of this is Goethe's Iphigenia in Taurus. Through the character of Iphigenia, Goethe does not simply retell an ancient legend. He also makes visible his own era's understanding of humanity and civilization. In his hands, Iphigenia ceases to be an ordinary mythological heroine and becomes a symbolic figure representing purification, the process of becoming truly human, and the transition from barbarism to civilization. It is worth recalling the myth itself. According to Greek mythology, Iphigenia was about to be sacrificed when she was rescued by Artemis and taken to the temple in Taurus. There, she became the high priestess of the goddess and, according to the legend, stood at the center of rituals in which non-Greeks were offered as sacrifices. In Goethe's interpretation, however, Iphigenia is far more than someone who merely fulfills this religious duty. Over time, she evolves into a figure who distances herself from violence, barbarism, and what were regarded as primitive forms of behavior, ultimately reaching a higher moral order. But toward what exactly is this transformation directed? On the surface, it appears to point toward ancient Greece. Yet, a closer examination reveals that it is not simply the historical Greece that is being portrayed. Rather, the ideal world that Iphigenia ultimately embodies corresponds to Winckelmann's vision of classical Greece, to the cultural ideals of Weimar Germany, and more broadly, to the utopian vision created by Western Philhellenism. In other words, while ancient Greece appears to be the subject, it is in fact the ideals of modern Europe that take center stage. It should also be acknowledged that this process has done a certain injustice to Hellenism itself. Instead of approaching the historical Greek world in all its richness and diversity, it has often been interpreted through the lenses of Romanticism and Classicism. As a result, Greek mythology gradually assumed an entirely different identity, moving away from its original historical context and becoming accepted through newly constructed meanings. For this reason, after the Renaissance, Greek mythology ceased to be merely the narration of ancient myths. At the same time, it became part of a process that ultimately prepared the end of myth itself. At first glance, this may seem paradoxical, but that is precisely what occurred. As myth contributed to the development of civilization, it gradually came into conflict with its own nature. The once holistic structure that explained birth and death, destruction and rebirth, humanity and nature as parts of the same cycle slowly began to fragment. That broad universe of meaning encompassing the shared experiences of human life was gradually displaced and replaced by a reorganized, carefully selected and purified version of Greek mythology. Thus, myth appeared to survive, yet it had already lost its original meaning. At this point, we must ask an essential question. What was the real force that prepared the end of myth? In my view, the answer is the European Enlightenment and its uninterrupted tradition of Philhellenism. The Enlightenment did not simply reject myth altogether. Instead, it did something far more remarkable. It transformed myth by using the very instruments of myth itself. It was as though it entered into myth and performed a kind of exorcism according to its own methods. Consequently, myth was not completely destroyed. Rather, it was stripped of its original spirit and placed in the service of a new intellectual order. Seen from this perspective, all the great cultural movements of Europe, from the Italian Renaissance and French Classicism to the Spanish Golden Age and Weimar's Classicism in Germany, followed essentially the same pattern. Rather than eliminating myth outright, they transformed it into another kind of myth. In other words, they reshaped myth through myth itself, breaking its original meaning and turning it into the bearer of a new cultural order. For this reason, the modern journey of Greek mythology, beginning with the Renaissance, was not merely the rediscovery of the ancient world. It was also a process in which myth, under the influence of the Enlightenment, lost its original wholeness. Put differently, a process in which it was culturally reshaped and ultimately distanced from its authentic nature. So, what emerges at the end of this entire process? If even myths come to serve the Enlightenment, becoming instruments that support individualism, the idea of progress, and all the teleological objectives of Enlightenment thought, then something fundamental has been fractured within the very nature of myth. Myth becomes alienated from its own essence, much like Gregor Samsa in Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Once a powerful structure that established its own universe of meaning and explained humanity and the cosmos together, myth now begins to speak in the language of another system of thought. As a consequence, myth itself inevitably changes. It loses its flexibility, vitality, and spontaneity, gradually becoming plasticized. That is, transformed into a cultural object molded from the outside and confined within predetermined forms. For this reason, it is no longer easy to call it myth in its original sense. Whether we approve of it or not, myth possesses a structure far broader, more comprehensive, and more holistic than the ideological frameworks of the Enlightenment. Myths speak not only to reason, but simultaneously to emotion, intuition, nature, collective memory, and the human experience of existence. This is precisely why, when one attempts to elevate myth into a universal meta-narrative valid for everyone and reduce it to a mere example that legitimizes specific cultural norms, one misses the very essence of myth. Myth is not simply a system of thought intended for an educated elite. It is also a living narrative preserved within the collective memory of ordinary people, transmitted from generation to generation, and continually nourished by shared social experience. The moment one attempts to redefine it exclusively through the language of a single ideology, it begins to cease being myth. At this point, a truly fascinating, indeed almost oxymoronic situation emerges. On the one hand, popular culture continues to live through the holistic nature of myths. On the other hand, academic classicism and Enlightenment thought reshape those same myths according to their own aesthetic and intellectual frameworks. Thus, throughout the historical process that unfolded from the Renaissance onward, a new cultural order operating from the top down gradually took shape. Within this order, Greek mythology no longer merely recounted the stories of the ancient gods in countless contexts. It also became a model that indirectly instructed people how to think, how to behave, and what kind of civilization they ought to embrace. In other words, beneath the mask of mythology, it became a vehicle for transmitting social norms, behavioral codes, and standards of civility. From this perspective, Nietzsche's famous 19th century declaration that God is dead should not be understood as a merely religious statement. It is also the sign of a profound historical and cultural transformation. But who is the God to whom Nietzsche refers? Clearly, he is not speaking solely of the Christian God. More broadly, what is collapsing is the single-centered worldview that directs humanity toward one ultimate goal, assumes that history possesses a predetermined purpose, and promises both worldly progress and spiritual salvation. What truly dies is this grand teleological narrative. So, what happens when such an immense void emerges? From the perspective of cultural history, we can see that this void was, to a great extent, filled by the figure of Dionysus. Dionysus symbolizes the return of everything that had long been repressed, the ecstatic, the excessive, and those aspects of human nature that cannot be fully controlled. It is as though an ancient voice silenced for centuries begins to speak once again. It is important, however, to make a crucial distinction here. The rediscovery of Dionysus was by no means Nietzsche's achievement alone. This is a common misconception, but it is not accurate. Nietzsche was one of the most influential representatives of a much broader intellectual movement that had already begun. Before him, Schelling's philosophy of nature, Friedrich Schlegel's romantic thought, the growing European interest in Eastern mythologies, the concept of dharma in Indian philosophy, discussions surrounding the continuity of the Atman, and reflections on the inseparable bond between humanity and the cosmos had already started to redirect European thought along a different path. Within this broader search, Dionysus became one of its most powerful symbols. With the re-emergence of Dionysus, myth itself begins to acquire a new significance within the modern world. The holistic structure that had seemed to disappear entirely returns in a different form. Admittedly, this is no longer the pure myth of antiquity. It is a myth reinterpreted by modern culture. Nevertheless, it reminds us once again that human beings are not creatures of reason alone, and that repressed emotions, intuition, chaos, and nature remain indispensable dimensions of human existence. For this reason, it would be a serious mistake to explain modernism solely in terms of progress, science, or technological advancement. In our understanding of modernity, we often imagine a linear movement toward continual improvement, as though humanity is always advancing towards something better. Yet, one of the most striking characteristics of modernity is precisely the opposite. As the modern world advances, the archaic elements that had long been suppressed gradually become visible once again. Alongside reason, return intuition, alongside order, chaos, alongside the individual, the collective consciousness, and alongside them, myth itself re-enters the stage. You may choose to interpret this development through Nietzsche, or evaluate it in light of Schopenhauer's pessimistic vision of the world. Or you may simply look at the art of the 20th century. Consider Edvard Munch's The Scream. Is that figure merely a person crying out in terror? Or does it represent modern humanity confronting its own inner abyss, its own loneliness, and the anguish of its own existence? Perhaps what we are witnessing is the silent scream that erupts as human beings gaze into the whirlpool of their own souls. For this reason, the great crises, wars, and cultural ruptures of the 20th century cannot be explained solely through political or economic causes. We must also recognize the dissolution of those artificial, sterile, and plasticized myths that for centuries had promised uninterrupted progress, reason, and the ideal of a perfect civilization. It is precisely at this moment of dissolution that modern humanity once again encounters the ancient myths it had long suppressed. Thus, after a long interruption, myth regains its wholeness, albeit in an entirely different form, and humanity is once more compelled to confront the darker dimensions of its own inner being.